Welcome to Food for Thought podcast, brought to you by the listeners of this podcast. Thank you everyone for valuing this podcast. You can do so by becoming a supporter, a member, a patron at joyfulvegan.com/donate. You can find the donate button, or you can go right to patreon.com/Colleen Patrick-Goudreau. And today's episode is supplemented by support from Plain Products, a vegan-owned company offering cruelty-free, zero-waste personal care products, free of animal products. They are a zero waste company that is closing the loop on waste. They offer shampoos and conditioners and body washes and body lotions and so much more. They package all of their personal care products in eco-friendly refillable bottles that you return empty when you're done. They sanitize them and refill them and then send them out to other happy customers. You can get a discount for these products if you go to joyfulvegan.com/hair, and at that page, you will find your 15% off discount link and code on all Plain products every time you place an order. So go check it out at joyfulvegan.com/hair. And thanks to Plain Products and to you, today's episode is Our Daily Bread is Vegan, a timeless staple across cultures and centuries. I love these episodes that are on food history and language. There's just so much to say about this particular food that is so ancient and so foundational to human civilization. So this is going to be a really fun episode. We're going to talk about some fun trivia. We're going to talk about some fun facts, history, language, as I said. And we're going to talk about the misconception that a lot of people have that bread is not suitable for vegans. It's a concept that it surprises me sometimes, because I will hear people say often, oh, I didn't think you could eat bread. I mean, I think there's a conflation between gluten-free and vegan. And I think there's an extreme misunderstanding. Some people, I don't think this is highly prevalent, but I think some people think, well, there's yeast and that's a living, it's a living yeast. And so vegans don't eat living beings, which yeast is not a living being. But I think some people have that notion. And then just in general, I think people have a misconception about bread and animal products. So we're going to talk all about that. First, a couple little chit-chat things I wanted to cover with you. I really hope you're doing well. I really appreciate all of your feedback about recent episodes. I've been getting a lot more emails, which is really lovely. You might remember, if you've been listening to this podcast for any length of time, that we used to do whole episodes of love letters that I would receive from people who listen to the podcast. I've been doing this podcast for 18 years, so things have obviously changed, which is a good thing, in the sense that change is good. And I don't receive as many emails because now comments are on social media and I get comments through the Patreon platform. But the point is, I really appreciate whenever you do leave a comment, wherever you listen to podcasts. I really appreciate when you email me. I really appreciate your support. And I haven't done a love letter episode. I could probably pull one off for the end of the year if you really want one, but you have to let me know. But the point is, I haven't seen a public review and rating over at like Apple Podcasts, for instance, and those kinds of things really do help. So if you can go over and leave a rating and a review, positive rating and review, hopefully, they really inspire people to listen. And that can be wherever you listen to podcasts, but I think Apple Podcasts is kind of the most popular still place where people listen. And I wanted to share an email I got recently because, I don't know, this is the kind of stuff that just floats my boat and just keeps me going and inspires me. And I'm really grateful to Jenna who wrote this email to me. She wrote, wanted to thank you for all that you do and send a quick story. I've been an avid listener of your beautiful podcast and started supporting the podcast through the Apple subscription. You had aired an episode last week regarding dairy and it was perfect timing. I'm vegan, but I was hosting my 1-year-old's birthday. And while I normally structure my hosted events vegan, I was contemplating giving quote unquote regular pizza, dairy pizza, for fear of people not liking the vegan version. Your podcast was perfect timing and reinforced my beliefs that celebrating my child should not involve fluids that resulted from the separation of mother and child. We have a great pizza place in Milford, Massachusetts. I think it's Massachusetts. It just says Milford, Mass. I think it's Massachusetts. Called Pizza Palace that has an amazing vegan menu of pizzas. And we ended up getting 8 large vegan pizzas plus the classic vegan apps of fries, etc. And nearly all the pizza was eaten. I was expecting a crazy amount of leftovers and was so happy to see that was not the case and did exactly as you suggested this week, which is that we did not announce that it was vegan. We simply offered it and everyone ate it up. Thank you for all you do on the larger scale for the animals and for little old me. Thank you so much, Jenna. I replied to Jenna and thanked her, and I just wanted to thank you publicly here. And that's the kind of thing that just makes me go, okay, I got things to say still. This many years in, people are still listening and still want to hear what I have to say. So I really appreciate it. And speaking of people and hearing what I have to say, if you're on my mailing list, you would have heard me talk about this. And if you're a Patreon supporter, you definitely would have heard me talk about this because I've been putting a lot of updates on our Patreon platform. But I was able to cultivate a relationship with a nonprofit organization in New York City, thanks to Ali Sorrentino, who you would have heard me mention on this podcast as a Patreon supporter. Ali has also traveled with us. I think she's done 5 trips with World Vegan Travel and Joyful Vegan Travel, and she's become a friend. And she connected me with this organization called Encore, which is an organization in New York City that serves senior community members, including those who are low income and vulnerable. And she had paid for the shipping for a number of the 30-day vegan challenge copies because some people did that. Thank you, everybody. And you're just distributing them. I still have some. If you are interested, you don't have to pay for the books. But if you're interested in any boxes of books, you just have to pay for the shipping. I can get a quote for you and you're still not obligated. But if you are interested, we are trying to get all of the books out of the warehouse. We were able to stop them from being pulped, which is great, but we do want to get them because next year it's going to be the same situation where we still have several hundred copies of books. I think we're down to probably several hundred copies of books, but we got to push them. We got to get them out. And so drop me a line if you're interested in that. But Ali had taken, I feel like 60 books, 70 books or something. And so she was trying to figure out creative ways to connect me with people in her life and how she could maximize our relationship and maximize my message. And so she connected me with Encore because she's on the board of Encore. And long story short, we put our heads together, Ali, me, the director, Jeremy, about how we can work together. And all that's to say is 60 plus people, it's more than 60 people, and more people are continuing to say, I want to join, have joined this program, the 30-day vegan challenge that they're using my book. Everybody has a copy of the book who joined, and Encore is supporting everyone in so many ways, and it has been so invigorating and so exciting, and it's something that I'm looking to replicate with other organizations. There's a lot to say. If you are a Patreon supporter, you will hear this over at Patreon. This is the kind of thing you get, direct access, and we have brainstorming sessions about how this can work. So if you want to hear more, do become a member. It's a really incredible community we have over there. So Encore already provides meals for their members, but what they're doing for the month of September is providing plant-based options for all of their meals. And this is actually something that they had on their agenda to reach that milestone by, I think, 2027. And now they've done it. So they're basically providing plant-based meals for anybody, whether they're part of the 30-day vegan challenge or not. But if you are part of the 30-day vegan challenge, you are definitely getting an incredible plant-based meal. And every time you come, every day. They're also giving people ready-to-eat meals twice a week. They can pick up their ready-to-eat meals, their frozen meals, and they can bring them home with them. They're also getting a bag of produce. They also got their lab work done, so they can measure the before and after, and they're going to be able to get their lab work done at the end. We had a kickoff. It was so high energy. We had folks from the mayor's office there. We had just so much energy. And I was there virtually teaching a cooking demo. And then they even made t-shirts for everybody. So people are wearing their 30-day vegan challenge t-shirts, which is adorable. And then we're offering weekly support meetings for people if they want to share, have questions. And we have a document where people can ask questions in between the week. We're just creating this incredible thing. And City Meals on Wheels, who already supports Encore and many other organizations around food, the executive director is so jazzed about the 30-day vegan challenge, and Jeremy has introduced me to her, and she's already been, we've been connected, but we are now going to talk about some other ways that I can work with them supporting other organizations that City Meal supports. So anyway, the point is, it is just super exciting, and the enthusiasm of the people who are doing this, it is just so, it is why I've always done this work, and it's this direct contact that I love so much. It's like seeing the people and having them ask questions and seeing their enthusiasm. And it's just, as you can tell, I'm very excited about it. And I want to just shout out to Denise Hoskins, who is a Patreon supporter, because I'm not getting paid for any of this. I'm not getting paid for any of the food that I did in the demo, my time, nothing. And I've spent already 20 hours on this, just in conversations and emails and planning and food and prep and having these calls and all of it, which I'm doing because this is what I do. And we are looking at ways that this could be replicated, but also funded possibly by some grants and what have you. But Denise Hoskins is a Patreon supporter who made a very generous additional contribution to me for all the work I've been putting in. I keep saying this, and I'm not saying this is not a marketing ploy. Patreon support is way down. So, my work has never been as monetized as it could or should be, but I'm telling you, when I say that you are the one supporting my work, I mean it. So thank you, Denise, for making that incredibly generous additional contribution, because this is where I've been putting all of my time. And then I have some cooking classes if you want to join. So far, the cooking classes seem to just not be viable anymore for people. I just don't know that people really want the online classes. So I'm only doing a few a year. The ramen class was very popular. So I have now a cooking class called Focaccia, the Art of Focaccia, making and designing edible masterpieces. So you're going to learn how to make really easy, basically no need focaccia, and it's the best focaccia you're ever going to have. And also we're going to make some garden art. And then I have our annual Joy of Holiday Vegan Baking cooking class. We're going to make cranberry Christmas cake, chocolate bread pudding, and classic thumbprint cookies with both jam and Nutella. So you can go to joyfulvegan.com for the classes and recipes. And then finally, we just sold one more room for our Paris to Dordogne Valley in June 2025. We're pretty close to selling the remaining cabins on our Croatia cruise from Dubrovnik to Split in September, October 2025. So if you are interested in those, go over to joyfulvegan.com again and click on trips. So let's get to bread. I actually tease my husband probably way too much. My husband's a breadhead. I guess I'm a breadhead in the sense that I get really excited about really good bread, and I love baking bread. That's why I'm a breadhead. David's a breadhead because David just can't not have bread in the house. I'm completely outing him here. But there are times where, for me, I think this was something Prue Leith said on the Great British Baking Show. But she when she tries something, baked good or whatever, she talks about it being worth the calories. And for me, I love that, because for me, if David just buys a loaf of bread, sometimes it's just Acme. They're good. They're bakery loaves at grocery stores, but there's good bread and there's good bread, and sometimes it's just good enough bread, and for me it's not worth the calories, so I'd rather have no bread. But when there's really good bread, and there are some incredible bakeries around us, Arizmendi if you live in the Bay Area, Starter Bakery, which is our favorite, and we definitely get bread when we go to the farmers market. Starter Bakery is one of them. Arizmendi is one of them, because we walk past Arizmendi when we walk to the farmers market. So I do love bread, and I do love baking bread, but I'm very particular. It's kind of like when I have tomatoes. Tomatoes is one of those things. Don't give me tomatoes if they're crap tomatoes. I only want tomatoes if they're like really, really good tomatoes. So if I order a sandwich in a shop, I often say, hold the tomatoes. Just don't even bother. So that's how I feel about bread. So I have some questions for you. Do you know why we call it a baker's dozen? Do you know the oldest form of leavened bread? Do you know who the pioneers of bread making were? And do you know what significant world-changing event in history was caused by bread shortages and high prices? We're going to talk about those things, because bread has just been such a significant part of, as I said, our human civilization. It's just been a huge, ancient part of who we are. And I mean it when I say that, because it's also so embedded, it being bread, in our language. We have so many words, and I have a whole podcast episode just on the words that we have from bread. That's an episode called Breaking Bread, Words from the Staff of Life. So I put together a fun little paragraph where I have 17 expressions, and these weren't even in that episode, some of them were. 17 expressions from bread. So, I thanked you for becoming a sustaining member. I'm not the breadwinner in my home. I'm not rolling in dough, but I know which side my bread is buttered on, and my podcast listeners do as well. In fact, more than any other source, Patreon supporters are the bread and butter of this operation. I've said again and again that I couldn't do this without your help, because of course I'm not doing this for the dough. Goodness knows there are easier ways I could earn my daily bread. Goodness knows I cast my bread upon the waters. Goodness knows I keep doing this podcast because I know that man cannot live by bread alone. And I want to empower people to live compassionately and healthfully and joyfully and abundantly. And I want to inspire people to stop thinking that bread always falls buttered side down. It doesn't. And half a loaf is better than none. And that's always been my message. Hope and joy and compassion and abundance. So welcome to today's episode, where we're going to break bread over the fascinating history of one of life's essentials, bread itself. And we're going to do that right here on the Food for Thought podcast, the best thing since sliced bread. My hope is that diving deep into the history and traditions of bread will give you something to chew on. After all, while Roman emperors, who were part of the upper crust, had to rely on bread and circuses to keep the people content, I intend to make this episode more rewarding than any spectacle ever featured in the Roman Colosseum. So whether you have a bun in the oven or you're just loafing about, I hope you enjoy this episode. Okay, it's not my finest work, but I think you get the idea. There's 17 expressions of bread. I think you probably heard most of them. There are plenty more. So you can go listen to that podcast episode, because I share not only expressions that come from bread, but specific English words that come from different languages' words for bread, whether they be Latin, Old English, French, Italian, and even Japanese. So go check out that episode called Breaking Bread, and I'll include it in the show notes so you can easily link over to it. So the word bread has its roots in ancient languages, and this is what's really fun. You hear me talk all the time about how the word meat was a word that was used to refer to all food, right? And we say that it was the substance of a thing. We say that something has, we're getting to the meat of the thing. We talk about coconut meat. We talk about the meat of a nut. So it was food. It wasn't animal flesh. Well, bread was the same way. So it likely derives from the Old English word, I'll just say bread. It would have been pronounced that way-ish. And that word meant piece of food. It meant piece of food. It meant crumb. And this term evolved from the Proto-Germanic word braudum, which referred to a broad range of fermented foods made from grain. And like I talk about with meat becoming narrowed down to refer to flesh, there is a connection between bread and the word food. So like the word bread and the word food are connected. And I know I'm going deep into some history of English language here, and I do have a podcast episode on a very brief history of English language, and that's in the Etymology podcast. But the English word food, right, starts with an F, and the Latin word for bread, which starts with a P, both came from the same Indo-European root word. And that original root was pa, P-A. For all intents and purposes, it was pa. We don't have a written language. It's the Indo-European root system. We don't have it written. This was all constructed, kind of back constructed, reverse constructed. So the original root was pa, which meant to feed or protect. And then under the series of sound changes known as Grimm's Law, the Indo-European p sound became a f sound in the Germanic languages, and English is a Germanic language. So that sound changed from a p to a f. And so the word pa, or the root pa, eventually evolved into the English word food. But within Latin, it stayed panis, right? So that's the word for bread. And so you have the Italian word pane because it didn't go into the Germanic change. So all of the Romance languages, all of the languages we have from Latin that did not go through the change through German, so all of the Romance languages like French and like Italian and like Portuguese, etc., those words still keep the p sound. So that's why you have pane, that's why you have pain for in French, that they kept the p sound. But English, which went through the Germanic changes, the sound p changed to fa, and that's why we have food. So that's all to illustrate that bread is just a fundamental part of who we are as humans, and of course in our language as well. This simple combination of flour, water, and salt, and sometimes yeast, and we're going to talk about that, or some other kind of leavener, has nourished humanity for thousands of years, evolving from very humble beginnings into this really rich tapestry of flavors and forms across the globe. And we're going to talk about some of them. Bread has been a staple in every culture's cuisine for thousands of years. Whether the grain is rye, barley, wheat, millet, sorghum, corn, whatever the raising agent is or lack thereof, whatever the shape, however it was, bread has just been part of human civilization for thousands of years. And what we're also going to talk about is that in its earliest forms, especially, it has been naturally plant-based, vegan, right? It goes back thousands of years before animal products were used. Bread goes back before agriculture. So it was before animals were domesticated. So we're going to talk about how bread is naturally vegan, plant-based, and we're going to talk about the most obvious ones that are vegan and the ones that aren't, what we can do to just veganize them ourselves at home for sure. And we're seeing more and more bakeries carry vegan loaves, etc. And finally, bread hasn't just been a source of sustenance for humans. It's also been a symbol of life, of community, of hospitality, and in many cultures, bread is sacred. Two of the most prevalent examples are in Christianity and Judaism. In Christianity, bread holds profound significance, symbolic significance, particularly in the ritual of communion or the Eucharist. And this is a sacrament where bread represents the body of Christ, commemorating the Last Supper when Jesus broke bread with his disciples and instructed them to eat in remembrance of him. This act of sharing bread symbolizes the spiritual nourishment that Christians believe comes from their faith. And in Judaism, bread plays a key role in religious rituals and symbolism. We talked about some of that in the episode I did on Jewish cuisine, particularly with challah and matzah. On Shabbat and Jewish holidays, challah, which is a breaded loaf, which I have a wonderful recipe for. You can find that at joyfulvegan.com. I'm very proud of my challah. It's a breaded loaf, and it's eaten to represent blessings and sustenance. And of course, during Passover, matzah, which is an unleavened bread, is eaten to commemorate the haste with which the Israelites fled Egypt, not allowing time for their bread to rise. And in both instances, bread symbolizes both divine providence and the Jewish people's historical struggles and resilience. So there's a lot more to say about how bread is used symbolically around the world, but those are just a few examples. In other cultures, offering bread is a gesture of hospitality and peace. One of my favorite movies, especially at Christmas time, is It's a Wonderful Life. And one of my favorite moments, I don't know if you remember this, is when Donna Reed's character, Mary Bailey, she brings gifts to the Martini family. They move into their new home. It's the first time they could afford a home, and they can do this because of the Baileys, lending bank. And she brings bread, salt, and wine. And she says, bread, that this house may never know hunger, salt, that life may always have flavor, wine, that joy and prosperity may reign forever. I love that. I love that. And I've often replicated that when I have brought gifts to people when they move into a new home. So remember that, bread, salt, and wine. And in fact, you can bring something else if you don't want to bring wine, but you get the idea. In Russian and Slavic cultures, bread and salt are offered as a traditional welcome to guests and so on. I'm going to do that. I love that. Welcome. Here's some bread and salt. So let's talk about the history of this ancient food. I love this stuff. This stuff just bakes my bread. I don't know, is that an expression? Just bakes my bread. By the way, I'm recording this in the wee hours of the morning because there are so many things happening around our house, houses being built, trees being cut. There's so much going on. And so I'm trying to record this before work starts getting done. But I have a feeling it's going to start any minute and I'm going to have to stop and come back. But let's talk about the history. Let's go back to the Paleolithic era. This is the Stone Age, right? This is the time that was defined by the use of stone tools and weapons long before agriculture was established. Now, you remember, just in terms of having some dates in your head, it's helpful to remember that the agricultural revolution happened around 10,000 years ago. Before that, that was kind of like in the Neolithic period, but before that was the Paleolithic period. And we have evidence that as early as 14,000 years ago, humans were grinding wild grains, mixing them with water, and baking what we would call flatbreads over open fires. Archaeological discoveries from Jordan revealed crumbs of ancient bread made from wild wheat and barley, showing that early hunter-gatherers were already experimenting with grain-based foods. It wasn't until the following period, the Neolithic period, around 10,000 years ago, again, that's around the time there was the agricultural revolution, that bread making became more sophisticated. Instead of relying only on wild grains, the advent of agriculture allowed for the cultivation of wheat, barley, and other grains, which became staple foods for early civilizations. Now, Egypt's fertile Nile Valley became the breadbasket of the ancient world, with Egyptians often depicted in tomb paintings baking bread, highlighting the central role of bread in their diet. The predictable annual floods of the Nile provided a dependable water source for agriculture. That's why it's considered the breadbasket. That's why it's considered this hub of cultivation, because it allowed for staple crops like wheat and barley, and it was predictable. These floods were predictable. Not the case so much now. But that consistent cycle of flooding enabled the Egyptians to develop advanced farming techniques and produce surplus food. The surplus of grains and other crops allowed the ancient Egyptians to engage in trade and support a thriving economy. The Nile Valley's agricultural bounty was central to the region's stability and prosperity, contributing to the growth of one of the most influential civilizations in the ancient world. But it was the discovery of wild yeast that marked a turning point in bread making history, leading to the development of leavened bread. Right? And leavened breads are just lighter, they're airier, they're taller, they're just fluffier than unleavened breads. So yeast predates our understanding of its microbial nature. The exact location of yeast discovery is not well documented, but here are some key points about its history, because yeast is fascinating. So ancient Egypt, again, evidence suggests that ancient Egyptians were among the first to use yeast in baking and brewing, because beer is part of this, or ale, brewing to make alcohol. The evidence is from about 5,000 years ago. They were among the first to use yeast in baking and brewing. So it's about 3,000 BC. 5,000 years ago, and they likely discovered yeast leavening properties accidentally, which is the case in so many of these stories, because bread dough and beer brewed from grain would ferment naturally due to airborne yeast. So it would have happened naturally. They would have discovered it accidentally. There are similar practices observed in ancient Mesopotamia, which is modern-day Iraq, and early forms of bread and beer were produced there. Archaeological findings indicate the use of fermented grain products in these ancient cultures from about 4,500 years ago, so just about 500 years later. And then in China and the Far East, we have evidence of yeast being used in the fermentation of alcoholic beverages and also bread. We have evidence of that from about 3,000 years ago, so a little earlier. And then the scientific understanding of yeast and fermentation came in the 19th century with Louis Pasteur's research into fermentation. And that provided insight into yeast's role in the process and kind of understanding the scientific foundation of it. And that's where we are today. So the oldest breads are found. The remnants, these are the bread remnants, are discovered at a site in Jordan, in northeastern Jordan, dating back 14,000 years, 14,400 years. This ancient bread resembled flatbread, and it would have been made from wild grains like barley. There was a grain called einkorn and oats, and it predates the rise of agriculture, as I said, which is about 10,000 years ago. And it suggests that bread making had a cultural significance before humans settled into farming. And so a lot of these cultures were also using bread as an offering to their gods. So it became part of their ritual, became part of their religion. So it goes back before agriculture. But ancient Egyptians are credited with refining the art of bread making. And there's a lot of good evidence that the world's first leavened bread was made here. Excavations, I said, from the tombs show these bread molds. We have remains of loaves. We have depictions of people making bread. And so it just indicates that bread was really an integral part of Egyptian daily life. We also have archaeological evidence in sites in Turkey from about 11,000 years ago. So that's really exciting. And then in Europe, we have charred remains of flatbreads from about 10,000 years ago, particularly in Greece. So one thing I wanted to talk about is, like what defines bread? Like what makes bread bread? Because there's going to be a lot of difference of opinions here. So bread at its core is food, any food, made from a dough consisting of ground grains mixed with water and baked. So very general definition of bread. A dough consisting of ground grains mixed with water and baked. Now, as I indicated originally, there was no yeast. It wasn't until the Egyptians started using wild yeast that leavened bread became prevalent. But it's worth saying that even if bread has yeast, it can still be considered a flatbread. Okay, so if there's yeast, it could still be considered a flatbread. And even if there's no yeast, it's still considered bread, though that can become contentious depending on who you're talking to, right? And in fact, there are breads that are debated and considered by some not to fall under the traditional definition of bread. So those flatbreads I talked about, like, would you consider matzah bread? I would. Would you consider tortillas bread? We don't really think of tortillas as bread, but they would fall under the category of bread, right? Same thing like with lavash or injera, the Ethiopian bread. So there's no hill I'm going to die on for any of these, by the way. And I'm pretty opinionated, but there's no hill I'm going to die on. The point is, those are the kinds of things that people like to sit around and discuss. And you can do so yourself, including things like things we call bread. Okay, maybe there's one hill I will die on. I don't know. Will I die on this hill? Banana bread, zucchini bread. These are more cake-like, right? They're not more bread-like. They're more cake-like, but we call them banana breads, maybe because we use a loaf pan. And the truth is, you could take that banana bread recipe batter and put it into muffin tins and you get banana muffins. But you don't put, something like a focaccia dough into muffin tins and now you've got muffins. So I don't think the tin just necessarily determines whether it's a bread or a cake. But there you go. Discuss among yourselves what you think about that. But those are the kinds of things that people really do argue about, which is great. I'd love to argue about. That would be a wonderful thing to just argue about. Wouldn't it be wonderful if life were that simple that that's our biggest argument, source of disagreement? So let's talk about the vegan nature of bread, because I do want to share all of these breads that are naturally vegan. And, I'm using vegan in quotes because I hate talking about food as being vegan. People are vegan. Food, I don't know. I don't like it. But plant-based, let's just say plant-based, because we're talking about breads and we're talking about grains. So, but I'll say vegan too. It's fine. I'm going to use it interchangeably because we're talking about animal products that would be added. So most ancient breads are naturally vegan, right? So most breads are vegan. Those are the ones, they're just made with grains and water and sometimes salt. And when you start getting into using enriched doughs, which would have things like cow's milk, chicken's eggs, that kind of thing, that's when you have animal products obviously in them. But enriched doughs didn't come about until much, much later. So when we're talking about the typical grains that would have been used, we're definitely talking about barley, would have been old ancient grain. There's a wheat, emmer wheat is an old ancient grain as well, but barley, wheat, ancient. In Asia, the ancient grains would have been millet and rice. And then, as we said, we've got wheat, we've got hard wheat for bread flour, we've got soft wheat for cakes and pastries, we've got rye, we've got oats, we've got spelt, we've got quinoa and amaranth and teff. Those are also ancient grains. We've got cornmeal and we've got sorghum. So those are the different kinds of grains we're talking about. But as far as using animal products in bread, that's a relatively recent phenomenon. And even today, many traditional breads remain free from animal products. And countries like France, especially France, who take this very seriously, bread is subject to a set of regulations aimed at preserving its quality and traditional methods. So there are bread laws in France that all bakers have to adhere to in order to be able to sell their bread. So according to French law, bread must be made from flour, water, yeast, and salt. No other ingredients can be added for a product to be classified as bread. And this definition helps maintain the purity of traditional bread. It must be sold fresh. It should not be pre-baked. It should not be frozen before sale. And this preserves, obviously, the quality and the authenticity. The baguette, for instance, is protected by French culinary heritage laws. A baguette must weigh like a certain amount. You have so many grams. It can only be flour, water, yeast, and salt. It must be baked fresh daily. It's subject to specific dimensions and baking conditions and so on. So these laws reflect France's commitment to preserving its rich bread-making traditions and ensuring that consumers know what they're getting when they order a baguette, which is pretty awesome. And this doesn't mean that there aren't breads that don't have animal products in them. There certainly are. But in general, traditional French bread, like a baguette, would not contain animal products. So you don't even have to ask. If you're in France and you're in a bakery, you don't have to ask. But there are some specialty breads. There are some commercial breads, of course, just in general, but also in France, that would have animal-derived ingredients. And you would typically find that they would be kind of milk derivatives. They'd be like lactose. They might be some kind of casein, so very small amounts. And I'm not saying that for any reason other than that's the fact. But you might find some that are made with butter, dairy butter. You might find some that are made with honey. You might find some that are made just very explicitly with cow's milk. So you just want to look at the ingredients when it comes to the commercial breads. When I say commercial breads, I mean kind of the sliced breads for sandwiches, like the sliced loaves. But bakery breads like batards, baguettes, ciabatta, focaccia, bagels even, for the most part, bagels might have an egg wash, but definitely batards and baguettes and ciabatta and focaccia, they would not have animal products in them unless it was specified. So we're going to come back to those bakery breads and more of those bakery breads that are typically made without animal products. So you just, I don't want to say you don't have to ask, but you could just relax a little bit because there are so many breads that are not made with animal products that are traditional, cultural, ancient breads. Now, there are plenty of breads that are made with animal products, and these are the breads that are made with enriched doughs. And enriched doughs refer to doughs that include extra ingredients like fats and sugars and dairy products, or I should say fats or sugars or dairy products. So you can have a variety of these things, of these extra ingredients to make an enriched dough. You could have one of these ingredients to make it an enriched dough, but that's basically what an enriched dough means. And that changes the flavor, it improves the texture, creates richness for sure. And so those additions would definitely be things like dairy-based butter, dairy-based milks, chicken's eggs, and sugar, as I said. So examples of enriched dough products that you would know: brioche, challah, typically, but challah is not without any animal products, cinnamon rolls, cinnamon buns, soft dinner rolls, those kinds of things. And if you see these things in a bakery, unless it's a vegan bakery or specified otherwise, they most likely contain animal products. I long for the day we walk into any bakery anywhere and we know that the default is no animal products and people have to ask for animal products. That's what I envision for the future. An example of an enriched dough recipe that I have, and I have several throughout my cookbooks and website, I highly recommend going over to joyfulvegan.com, typing in saffron buns. They're also called Santa Lucia buns, and they're Swedish buns. They're made with saffron. They are to die for, or to live for, however you look at it. They're made with non-dairy butter and non-dairy milk, and the saffron is what makes them this gorgeous yellow color, this golden color, and they're just so delicious. So go check those out. And of course, in the Joy of Vegan Baking, I have cinnamon buns, I have babka, I have monkey bread. Challah is also at joyfulvegan.com. So go check those out. But of course, you can find recipes for any of these enriched dough bread products online, and you can make them yourself. Although I do always encourage you to support your favorite and favorites, and even non-favorites, vegan cookbook authors. So, but recipes abound is my point. So let's talk about some breads around the world that are already by default, by nature, plant-based, that come from different cultures around the world. These are breads you are going to be familiar with. And these are breads that, I'm going to start with flatbreads, because flatbreads are the oldest forms of bread. And these are the ones that you go, oh yeah, okay, yeah, no. And when people ask you, is bread vegan? You go, and this is you're going to list 5 of these. You're going to memorize that answer, and so you're going to say 5 flatbreads, and then we'll get to the yeasted breads. We're going to get to, well, there is a yeasted bread in my flatbread list, but we'll get to the other breads as well. But starting with flatbreads, you're going to memorize 5. So when someone goes, is bread vegan? You go, yeah, pita's vegan, tortilla's vegan, matzah's vegan, injera's vegan, papadam, right? Anyway, I'm going to get to that. Okay, so starting with pita. So pita it originates from the Middle East. I know you're not going to remember all these dates, but I like to give dates to give you just kind of an idea of how old each one is. It goes back to about 2000 BC. So that's about 4,000 years old. Pita is, that's pretty cool. Made very simply with flour and water and yeast and a little salt, sometimes oil, and it's known for its little pocket, and that's pita. So most everyone is familiar with pita. Tortilla, as we discussed earlier, this is a staple from Mesoamerican civilizations dating back 10,000 years. 10,000 years. Now, when I say tortilla, I am referring to the original tortilla, which would have been made from maize, not flour. Eventually, it would have been made with flour as well. We have tortillas with flour, but originally it would have been made with maize, corn, and tortillas remain a key part of Mexican cuisine, of course, whether they are made with corn or wheat. And then we mentioned matzah already. This is a traditional unleavened bread made simply with water and flour, and this has been used in Jewish Passover rituals since at least the 13th century BC. We have a flatbread from South Asia, from India, chapati, which is about 2,000 years old, and this is made with whole wheat flour, typically cooked on a flat skillet. Sometimes the Indian breads might have ghee, a clarified butter, just kind of brushed on them at the very end. So just ask, and a lot of the places who do that can just not do that, not put the ghee on at the end for you. Chapati would be one of them. But the ingredients for the chapati itself would be without any animal products. Lavash is an ancient flatbread from the Caucasus region, and that dates back over 1,000 years. And this is kind of like pita, and just it's simple. It's water, flour, salt, sometimes yeast, but lavash is typically unyeasted, unleavened. And it's always vegan. It's kind of like chocolate. It's like if someone's putting animal products in lavash, that's not lavash. You know, when someone puts, I don't know, cow's milk in dark chocolate, I don't know. Okay, I guess it's still chocolate. But my point is, you're changing it. You're changing kind of the base of it. So lavash, by definition, would not have animal products in it. Injera, and if you've ever had Ethiopian cuisine, you know how amazing this particular spongy sourdough flatbread is from Ethiopia, made primarily with teff flour. It's been part of Ethiopian cuisine for over 2,000 years, and it serves both as a plate and as a utensil and as a yummy goodness. I love injera. I've been meaning to make it from scratch. I haven't done so yet. The fall and winter, it's my baking time. I really don't bake in like the summer and the spring. I'm just eating fruit at that time. But in this fall and winter, I am definitely one of those people who just bakes up a storm. And maybe it's time to finally try my hand at injera. Another staple in India is roti. So also 2,000 years old. A lot of these are 2,000 years old, as you're maybe getting the sense of. Similar to chapati, roti is made from whole wheat flour and it's served alongside curries. It's delicious. But my favorite Indian flatbread, maybe yours too, is a papadum. Oh, it's because it's fried. Like, like everything fried is good. Oh, it's a traditional crisp bread. You've had this. And these roots go back 2,000 years, originating in India, made from either lentil or chickpea flour and spices, and then it's fried or it's roasted. Sometimes it's roasted, and it has this characteristic crunch. It's kind of oily. It's delicious. The spices in it, the lentils. I love papadum. Love papadum. Another Indian favorite of mine is dosa. Dosa sometimes will have, actually, it's not true. I was going to say sometimes they put ghee on it. No, they don't. It's very rare. It's very rare. So my preferred Indian cuisine, I'm not a huge lover of Northern Indian cuisine. My preferred Indian cuisine is Southern. And I'm not just saying that because the south of India tends to have more vegetarian than the north. The north was kind of more of the British dominated area. So it just became a lot more globalized and it became a lot more meat heavy. Whereas Indian cuisine in the south of India remained vegetarian. And so you can find probably right near you, you would maybe be surprised to know that you could probably find a Southern Indian restaurant and it would be all vegetarian. Vegan, not necessarily, but all that's not vegan would be a couple milk products, cow's milk products, some ghee, maybe brushed on the roti or something like that. But dosa is, it's basically like a big crepe. It's a big pancake and it's a big flatbread and it is thin. It's a little crispy. It's like a crepe. Just imagine just a very large crepe made from fermented rice and lentils. And this goes back 1 to 2,000 years. And it has this fermentation in it. Like it's been fermented, as I said, the rice. So it's just got this really nice tangy flavor. And then it's filled with whatever you want. Potatoes and spinach, all manner of things. Love dosa. I love it. And then finally, I'll just do one more flatbread from South India, which is uttapam. Uttapam, sometimes called uttapam. It's a big pancake, thicker, and it's made from a similar batter to dosa, but it reminds me of like the Chinese scallion pancakes because often you just have the toppings, but I would say they're not toppings because they're baked in to the uttapam, like tomatoes, like onions, chilies, green onions, and I love it. Whenever my husband and I go to one of our favorite Indian places in the Bay Area, actually, our favorite place is Adupi Palace in Berkeley, but dosa is also another one that's really good. And there's a couple locations in San Francisco, and David always gets the uttapam and I always get the dosa. That's usually how it goes, and I do love it. I'm always a little jealous. I'm always a little like, oh, I want the uttapam. But I love my dosa. So that's another flatbread. And then moving on to Venezuela and Colombia, we have arepas, which are traditional flatbreads made from pre-cooked cornmeal called masarepa. It's kind of like a masarina, but a little different. It's not nixtamalized. But it's still a pre-cooked cornmeal. And then you just shape it into flat discs, grill it, pan fry it, or bake it. And often it's stuffed with like meat or cheese, dairy cheese, but you can serve it with whatever you like. So that's a flatbread they have just a couple different variations from Venezuela versus Colombia, arepas. And then you have pancakes. Like pancakes are flatbreads. Basically, that's what they are. And the earliest forms of these pancakes go back to ancient Greece, ancient Rome. Sadly, pancakes in most restaurants are made with animal products, which is so stupid and easy to alter. I have a very famous pancake recipe in The Joy of Vegan Baking. I also have a crepe recipe. So crepes would be another kind of flatbread. But you see how we're getting in here where you're like, I don't think about crepes as bread. It's by definition. But again, go have that discussion among your friends. I think it'd be a great party conversation. Then we finally there's two more. Another kind of pancake is from Russia. It's a blini. They're usually yeasted, and then they're served with toppings like sour cream. And that's a blini. And then finally, we have a flatbread that is yeasted, which I know sounds weird, but as I said, just because there's yeast doesn't mean it's not a flatbread. The yeast does not make it a flatbread, or not. The lack of it doesn't make it a flatbread, and the presence of it doesn't make it not a flatbread. Did you follow that? So focaccia, it's included in a list of flatbreads because it's relatively flat compared to other types of bread. Uh, Even though it's thicker than your traditional flatbreads, than flatter breads like pita and lavash, it's made, usually on like a single broad flat layer. And I'm not kidding you. I'm not just saying this. I just had some before I started recording because I just made a batch of focaccia yesterday, and I shared it with some guys who were doing some work outside. I made some focaccia with beautiful tomatoes and rosemary, and that's what you'll learn to make in the cooking class if you join. But focaccia is considered a flatbread. It has a fluffier texture because of the leavening, but it's also kind of considered like one of the, it's like a precursor to modern pizza. And I discussed that when I was talking about pizza in the Italian cuisine episodes, because we talk about Italy inventing pizza, and it's like, well, yes, and you can kind of see why. Yeah, the concept of having this dough that's made with flour and water and a little salt, if that, it goes back even definitely before the ancient Romans, and definitely before the time pizza as we know it today was invented. So flatbreads are ancient, right? And focaccia specifically, as the kind of flatbread from Italy, we don't know the specifics, but it's possible that it originated with the Etruscans before they were wiped out by the ancient Romans, by the Romans, and the Romans would have just taken that and run with it. And that's why we have focaccia still today. And that would have been about 2,000 years ago. So you have to think about it as being a little different than what we know today when we think of focaccia. It didn't have garden art. It was a bit more rough and ready, but that is the idea. Now, modern bread recipes may sometimes include non-vegan ingredients, but as you can see, I'm trying to demonstrate that the most popular and ancient breads remain naturally vegan. Those commercial sliced breads for sandwiches, we'll get to those. Those are so inferior to any of these breads we're talking about. And it's not to say that I don't ever have them. It's rare that we buy a, loaf of bread that way. But look, I know you give kids, you're making sandwiches, you want something for the road, that's totally fine. But it is rare for me to even buy those sandwiches. I think I bought some for a road trip we were doing about 6 months ago. Okay, maybe not even 6 months ago, because I do try to clean my fridge out and make sure there's nothing in there older than 6 months. It's still sitting in there. I used a few slices, and then I put it in the freezer because I just never use it. Again, not worth the calories in my opinion. For me, if I'm going to make a sandwich, I'm going to want to use something like one of the bakery breads rather than the, kind of commercial pre-sliced breads. So when we're talking about the breads that are not flat breads, that are not that commercial sliced bread, but more traditional global breads that are traditionally made vegan, they're traditionally made with simple plant-based ingredients, and part of this, this history we're talking about. Let's talk about a few of those and move on from flatbreads. So number one, I would say sourdough. So I'm going to answer the questions that I asked in the beginning at the end of the episode, but I'll just give you a little hint here. Sourdough is one of the oldest forms of leavened bread. It originated thousands and thousands of years ago, made using wild yeast from natural fermentation. But it became very famous in San Francisco during the gold rush. Woot woot. So representing here, but truly. And then, of course, it became super popular during COVID when everyone was making sourdough bread. Can't say I'm on the sourdough bandwagon. Don't judge me and don't turn off this podcast. I like sourdough. I don't love it. I like fermented flavors in something like an injera, right? But if you put a batard in front of me or a sourdough loaf in front of me, I'm going to take the batard any day. And same thing with a baguette. Although I have to say, baguettes, It's one of those things. You know how there's certain things you don't eat unless you are in the country or in the place or in the restaurant, right? Of people who know this food really well. I rarely get baguettes when I'm not in France. And I know that I'm making myself sound really fancy schmancy, but we do go to France a lot, and we have been to France a lot over the last several years, especially doing these trips. We'll be going back again. You can join us in June of 25. But honestly, baguettes, as most Americans know them, oh, they're not baguettes. I am not a huge fan of baguettes, and I would have said that before I went to France, because the baguettes we get in the United States, meh. And it's probably because they're not adhering to all of those criteria that baguettes in France have to. But there is one bakery. It's a local bakery. I mentioned it at the top of this episode. If you are in the Bay Area, it's called Starter Bakery. Their baguettes are fantastic. So when we go to the farmer's market, I will get a Starter Bakery baguette. They also have sourdough, and I don't get it. David does. I also did not get on the bandwagon of all of the sourdough starters. I tried. You can write to me. You can thrash me. You can guide me. But I have tried. I have had people give me their sourdough starters. It's too fussy for me. And I take care of things. Believe me, I am a gardener. I have animals. I know how to take care of wildlife. I know how to take care of plants. It's not that I don't have the patience or ability to care for something like that, but I found it fussy. I just didn't like it. I like dried yeast. I like just using a dry packet of yeast, or I get it in bulk from the bulk store. That's my preference. But sourdough, flour, water, salt. That's it. And your starter, your yeast, obviously. Okay, baguette. We discussed baguette. I have not made a baguette from scratch. I cower at the thought. I tried. I made a couple. I'm like, I'd rather just like wait till I go to France and like get a baguette there, or I'll get starter bakeries. But baguette is one of those things, as we already discussed. Naturally vegan by definition, by design. There you go. Flour, water, yeast, salt. Batard, I mentioned, it's a wider version of the baguette. So I guess I eat that because we have another bakery, Arizmendi, nearby, and their batards are amazing. Love them. I love the seeded batard. I love the plain batard. Love it. And so it's a really nice practical alternative to that longer loaf. And it's easier to kind of make sandwiches with. Baguettes are kind of harder to make a sandwich with, but same ingredients as a baguette, different methods. I mean, very similar methods, to be honest, but it's just different size. Flour, water, yeast, salt. Then one of my favorite breads, also when I'm in Italy, although focaccia is my favorite bread, but one of my favorite breads from Italy has a really fun history, and that's the ciabatta. I think we talked about it maybe in one of the Italian cuisine episodes. It was created only in 1982. Because it was an Italian response to the popularity of French baguettes. So there were bakers who were like, we want to create a bread that is like a national symbol of Italy, the way a baguette is a national symbol of France. I don't know that it's worked. I don't think ciabatta has the same resonance that baguettes do. I think focaccia is probably a bread that people associate with Italy more than ciabattas do, but I love ciabatta. It means slipper because it has this kind of flat, rounded shape like a slipper. I have made ciabatta a few times, but my favorite go-to bread to make is a focaccia. I just keep talking about focaccia because I got focaccia on my brain. I got focaccia on my mind. I got focaccia on my, probably have some crumbs on my lap. Okay, so that's ciabatta, flour, water, salt, yeast. So these are the kinds of breads you don't walk into a bakery and be like, is there eggs in them? They're not. Rye bread is next. Rye bread has been around for thousands of years, considered one of the oldest types of bread, dates back to at least 500 BC, so it's about 2,500 years ago, in the regions of Eastern Europe and Scandinavia. Rye was cultivated in these areas because it could withstand and can withstand the cold northern climates that wheat struggles to thrive in. Now, over time, it became a staple food, particularly in regions like Russia, Germany, Poland, where it's often used to make really dense sour loaves. And I do like the sourness of rye. I do. I love it. So rye was important for sustenance as it stayed fresh longer and it was more nutritious than bread made from wheat alone. So typically vegan, again, bakery wise, rye flour, water, salt, yeast. And so is another one. There's another type of rye bread that originated in Germany, in Westphalia, which is kind of in northwestern Germany. And it's made with coarsely ground rye and baked at a low temperature for a really long period, up to 24 hours, which gives it that really dark color. I would say American recipes, the dark color comes from the addition of molasses, which wouldn't have been in the traditional recipe, but that's fine. You can add molasses, and that's pumpernickel. So I grew up eating rye bread and pumpernickel because if you remember my episode on Jewish cuisine, I grew up in New Jersey. And of course, New Jersey, New York, and one of the towns I lived in New Jersey is where we have, the largest Jewish communities are in New York, New Jersey area in the U.S. And in the town I lived in was actually had one of the largest Jewish populations, probably still does, Livingston, New Jersey. And so what does that mean? There were delis all around us. Access to rye bread was everywhere. And it was something that was just a staple in my diet growing up because Jewish immigrants from countries like Poland and Russia brought these bread traditions to the United States in the late 19th and 20th century, early 20th centuries. And they were definitely a staple in my diet, not just from Jewish delis, but just in the stores everywhere, the bakeries all around would have rye and pumpernickel. And so my memory of growing up is having a lot of sandwiches made from rye bread, although I have to tell you, and this is the case to this day, I do not like the little caraway seeds in my rye bread. I love seedless rye, which is probably more traditional. I don't think caraway seeds were super traditional in Eastern Europe, but I'll go deeper on that to find out for sure. I'm sure you'll send me emails to let me know either way, but I do not like seeds in my rye bread, but I love rye and I love pumpernickel. I don't have pumpernickel a lot, but I remember growing up with pumpernickel toasted with butter, but rye bread was used to make sandwiches I ate. They were definitely deli sandwiches. I grew up eating meat, so they would have been all manner of, cold cuts, deli meats in my sandwich. But I was writing this episode and I started thinking about something I hadn't thought about in many years, which was marbled rye. I don't know if you remember that, and I haven't seen it in years, and it's probably something that's still prevalent on the East Coast, but it was like a two-tone rye bread. It was made with dark rye and light rye, and so it's called marbled rye because it looked marbled once baked. I need to make some of that. I need to get some of that. There's not as many Jewish bakeries in California, so I'm just going to have to make my own. Or if you have any recommendations, let me know. So that's rye and pumpernickel go back a long way. And then kind of speaking of another kind of traditional bread from Poland, Jewish tradition, is the bagel. We talked at length about bagels in the Jewish cuisine episode. Bagels originated in the Jewish communities of Poland as early as the 17th century. They're boiled before they're baked, which gives them that really dense, chewy texture. I make bagels all the time. I do have a bagels on demand cooking class. Bagels are so satisfying to make from scratch, and pretty much flour, water, yeast, salt, sometimes malt. Sometimes bakeries will put an egg wash, I mentioned earlier, but most places, authentic bagels would not have an egg wash. They'd just be vegan. I'm sure people would say there's some authentic bagels that do have egg wash. I'm just going to stick by that. Not going to die on that hill, but I'm just going to say it's very traditional for bagels to not have an egg wash. And then going deeper to my people, because I'm Irish, I'm 3/4 Irish, quarter Italian, and the bread from my people, from my land, is soda bread. And this was an example of a bread that is made with a leavener, but not yeast. It's made with baking soda. And it was a much more accessible, inexpensive way of making bread. If you didn't have access to yeast, people had access to baking soda, which was very cheap. And so that's what soda bread is. And I don't know if it's worldwide, but I think it's pretty common. It's a really good bread to make in a pinch. It's not one of my favorite breads, but it's a really nice bread to make in a pinch, especially if you don't have yeast. Goes back to about the 19th century and considered a quick bread because of the baking soda as opposed to the yeast. So you don't have to wait for it to, ferment basically. So, but again, basic flour, baking soda, salt, water. You might find some recipes, and I would ask if you're in a bakery, to be honest, because they might use cow's milk. But obviously, if you're making it yourself, you just use plant-based milk. So you get the idea. You get the idea. Next time someone says to you, is bread vegan? I want you to remember 5 flatbreads and 5 non-flatbreads and just say, yeah, and name them. And people go, oh, I didn't know that. So it's just a nice way to round out and to just kind of just remind people, okay, you don't have to remember 5 of each, but 5 total. So you'll just be like, yeah, baguette, pita, lavash, sourdough, bagels. There you go. They're vegan. And they go, oh, okay. All right. So just wanted to give you something to bring to the world, to give to the world. That's what I'm giving you. Now, when it comes to bread, so someone asked me, we had one of our Q&A sessions with the folks I'm working with at Encore, and one of the women asked about sliced bread. She was concerned about bread. She's like, is bread vegan? Like, whatever. So, obviously I have an entire hour-long episode on whether it's vegan or not, but we did talk about the sliced bread because I did say, go to the bakery. If you go to the bakery and you're getting kind of, your typical bakery breads, they're going to be vegan. When it comes to these sandwich breads, yeah, sometimes they're going to be honey or milk derivatives. And sometimes eggs, but really not that much. They're often they just have a lot of preservatives because they're just meant to be shelf stable. But there are plenty that are vegan. I did say to her, listen, she's doing so well. She's doing so much. It's the low level stuff, these little tiny ingredients. If you don't know the source of the salt, I don't know, right? Could it be animal derived? That is just, to me, getting so far away from the point that it just misses the point, and I don't want to overwhelm people. So for someone like me, yeah, I'm just going to look at the ingredients and, kind of once you know the brands, you just know the brand. So it's not like you have to research this for hours and days, and it's not like you have to stare at ingredients labels. Once you know the brands, then you just kind of take a quick look and there you go. And sometimes, of course, it's annoying because it's like, I just needed this stupid bread. Why are they putting stupid milk in it, right? So sometimes it's annoying, but you just move on with your life. But Dave's Killer Bread, there's a lot of varieties that don't use animal products. Ezekiel Food for Life, they have a lot of their sprouted grain breads that are vegan. And these are going to be the better ones anyway, because they're going to be whole grains and they're going to be whole wheat. So yay. Then you've got Arnold, Oro wheat. They use whole grains also, but just check the ingredients. Nature's Own, their whole wheat bread is vegan. Trader Joe's, some of their breads, like their sprouted multigrain and their sourdough is vegan. Rudy's Organic Bakery, they have a lot of vegan options in their line of breads. Alvarado Street Bakery and 365 by Whole Foods, they have a lot of breads that are vegan. So just double check the labels, but honestly, it's such a minor thing, and I don't think they're worth the calories anyway. Go get some better bread that's already naturally vegan and much more traditional. Not that that's what you're solving for. If you're solving for convenience, then just go get your sliced bread. Fine. Okay, as promised, here's a little bit of bread trivia, and then we're going to close up this episode. Number 1, Baker's Dozen. Do you know why? So we talked about the laws in France. There were laws in medieval England because of people trying to get away with selling bread to people that was cheap, that was just kind of cheating, that wasn't using actual flour. They were putting filler in it. And what they would also do is they would have to adhere to these laws around weight of the bread. So a baker's dozen means 13 items instead of 12. It dates back to this time, to medieval England. Bakers would add an extra loaf to a dozen to avoid being penalized for selling underweight bread. So they needed to meet these legal weight standards, and so they would add an extra loaf to just kind of cover their butts. And so that's why we call it a baker's dozen. Not fun. History. It's amazing. Okay, sourdough I already mentioned is one of the oldest forms of leavened bread. Its origins are also in ancient Egypt, about 1500 BC. Romans were the pioneers in bread making. They used mills to grind wheat into flour and then developed the different types of bread, including these leavened loaves and the flatbreads. And their innovations laid the groundwork for modern bread making techniques. So that's what the Romans did. They did leave us some good things, even though they took a lot of their ideas from other places. Read Greece and Etruscans. And then finally, bread shortages. Bread shortages throughout history have led to civil unrest, for sure. But the French Revolution, when you really understand what was going on and what fueled it, there were a number of things. But one of the things that fueled the French Revolution was bread shortages and high prices. And that contributed to the storming of the Bastille in 1789. And it also contributed to, was it the bakers, like the women who went to Louis XVI? They were there because they could not afford to make bread. I mean, the most basic food that people relied on, they couldn't make. And so that whole scene of the women marching to the palace, I can't remember if it was Versailles or the Tuileries. But anyway, the point is the women marched there and it was because of bread. It's because of bread. Bread is the staff of life. I mean, it really is just such a huge part of our lives. I imagine for a moment, I know you can, because some people don't eat bread. Some people don't eat gluten. Some people don't eat wheat. Fine. But I don't know. A world without bread, it is a very interesting contemplation. Another topic for a party I encourage you to have. A world without bread. Imagine. Go think about that. In the meantime, I hope to see you somehow, somewhere, some way, social media, one of my online cooking classes, one of my trips. For the animals, this is Colleen, Patrick-Goudreau. Thanks for listening.